Well, thank you, Gina, for letting me present Professor Ananda Cohen-Aponte from Cornell University. She's a colleague that I know for many years now. It's an inspiration for her work and the new avenues that she is opening with her study of indigenous visual culture. And this morning, she's going to talk us about the photography of the work of photography, but not only the work of photographer Martín Chambi, but its connection to the whole space of Andean visual traditions. And so I would like to say a couple things about Professor Cohen-Aponte. She is Associate Professor of History of Art at Cornell University and works on visual culture of Latin America with a special interest in issues of cross-cultural exchange, historicity, identity, and anti-colonial movements. Her recent book, Heaven, Hell, and Everything in Between, Murals of the Colonial Andes, was published in 2016 by Texas University Press, a very renowned publisher for topics related to Latin America. And that book explores the intersection between art, politics, religion, and society in mural paintings located in colonial churches across the southern Andes. She also served as editor and primary author of the book Pintura Colonial Cusqueña, El Esplendor del Arte en los Andes, and that was published in Spanish and in English and in Peru, I think. Her essays appear in a range of journals, including Colonial Latin American Review, The Americas, Alpanchis, and Latin American and Latinx Visual Culture. She's currently working on a new book that explores the role of the visual arts in fomenting an insurgent imaginary in the late 18th century in Peru and Bolivia. And with this, before I start passing her the time, I would like to say that this lecture is part of the Andean and Indigenous Lecture Fund, which was established thanks to the generosity of a student here at Portland State that have seen this as a possibility to explore what is happening in other regions of the world, especially on the Andes, but also with the production of culture of indigenous communities across the world. So this is a wonderful initiative. This is our third lecture. We had a couple more in the years before. And after that, I just want to also acknowledge the presence here of some of my colleagues here in the university, outside the university too. And I would like to welcome all them and join us to hear now Ananda Cohen from Cornell. Thank you, Nandi.
Thank you so much, Enrique, for the invitation. Thank you to you and your colleagues at Portland State for helping to make this happen, for the invitation and for your attention to my presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you can see my PowerPoint. I just wanted to say too that, you know, if anyone has questions along the way or, you know, I would love to keep this conversational as much as Zoom might allow for it, but I very much appreciate any feedback or questions that you have. I should mention that, you know, my training is in colonial Andean art history, but I have a real affinity to the work of Chambi. And as a matter of fact, one of my side projects was looking at the indigenista movement. And so and Chambi figured large in one of the articles that I've published on the subject. And I'm happy to share that with all of you if you might be interested in it after the talk. So the title of my talk today is Alternative Modernities in the Andes, Martín Chambi and His Visual World. And just for starters, Martín Chambi was a highland Peruvian artist of indigenous descent. He was from the southern Andean town of Puno, which is located close to the Peruvian-Bolivian border. And he was born in 1891. And we know that he encountered the camera when he was working in a mine as a small child. And he began his career in Arequipa and moved to the city of Cusco in the 1920s, where he spent the rest of his life until his death in 1973. He enjoyed an extraordinarily long and fruitful career in the city of Cusco. And Cusco itself was, historically, a real vibrant center for indigenous and mestizo artistic production from the Inca period all the way into the present day. But in particular, the 1920s were a really rich moment of cultural production and discourse. And what I would really like to do for this presentation is to not only talk about Chambi, but to situate him within these larger frameworks of both alternative modernities in the Andes. And of course, I take my cue from scholars like Deborah Poole, who's written about vision, race, and modernity in Peru in the 20th century, and many other scholars. And I'm also interested in couching it within these movement of indigenismo, which many of you are probably already familiar with from your courses with Professor Cortez and others in the department, to really try to understand what is the larger context in which we can place his extraordinary and prolific photographic work. So one thing that I would like to sort of get us started on to thinking is how we talk about modernity in a Latin American context. And specifically because of my training in art history, I would like to frame this through an art historical lens. I think that is very common for us when we think about modern art, that we often see it presented as this an inherently Western phenomenon, one that is centered within Europe, Western Europe, and United States. And the general kind of narrative about modern art goes a little something like this. And for any of you who have taken an art history class, this is probably already common knowledge to you. But when we talk about the advent of modern art within a European context, the standard narrative is, we begin with the Impressionists, right? So people like Claude Monet, who are really interested in exploring the interplay between color and light. And oftentimes they would document the same scene at different times of the day to try to show how the interplay of light and shadow can be expressed through the color palette. And then we begin to see how that the movement from a realist lens to an impressionist begins to be further broken down when we look at cubism, right, in the works of someone like Cézanne, who begins to reorganize compositions and subtly modify brushstrokes to give us a more geometric, abstracted rendering of space. And the real turning point, right, in that transition into full cubism actually began when we look at works like Cézanne's Still Life with Apples, right? And this is a very famous example from the history of art where he decided that he was interested in trying to capture the composition from a variety of angles simultaneously. And the way that he did that was to institute a break from three-point perspective and to tip the table forward, right? So that you can not only see the apples and the rest of the fruit from a profile view, but that you can also simultaneously see them like from a 3/4 or an aerial view. And this, of course, made way for the move towards increasing abstraction and cubism that we see most famously memorialized in the work of Pablo Picasso, his famous Les Demoiselles d'Avignon from 1907. And I present this just as kind of a foil for us to think about how modernism, particularly within the visual arts, unfolded in Latin America in such a different way, right? So in terms of like the history of Western art, if we're only confining it to Paris, essentially, we're able to trace a very kind of straight line from realism into abstraction and all of the avant-garde discourses that are caught up with that. In Latin America, and I'll just kind of keep ourselves centered on the Andes, we see that unfold in a really different way. Well, for one, right, we have the existence of abstraction as a specific visual strategy that in place as early as the pre-colonial period, right? So abstraction was a device or it was an artistic and aesthetic strategy that was employed by indigenous peoples long before the Spanish conquest, from Chavin all the way to the Incas. So the first image that we're looking at on our left is the Alto Capu tunic that was created from tapestry weave, is Inca period, would have been worn by an Inca ruler from the 15th century, currently housed at the Dumbarton Oaks Museum in Washington, DC. And we see then that there was already that rupture in place when we look at the kind of transition from an Inca aesthetic system to the colonial period. With colonization, we also have the advent of naturalism and realism and pictorial figural representation that's all part and parcel of the colonial project, particularly when we think about the importance of religious images in the evangelization project. So one could say that, you know, Latin American and in particular Andean art history is marked by these series of artistic ruptures, right? Then we see the move towards landscape painting and this more kind of idealized representation of land and an academic style that would have been promulgated through the establishment of art academies across all the major Latin American capital cities. So this is Rugenda's view of the environs of Lima from 1843. What I also want to point out, right, is that the transition back to abstraction, one could say, was a very dramatic one when we're talking about South American art. And we know that there were a lot of artists who were trained in their home countries, but who later acquired their artistic education in Paris, came back to their home and were employing many of these avant-garde principles in their art. And this was met with varying degrees of acceptance and in some cases outright rejection. But I just bring this in kind of as an alternative genealogy when we're thinking about the impact of modernity and all of its complexities and contradictions in an Andean context. We can think about it in terms of like a fragmented modernity, a modernity that also becomes Andeanized, as we see in the work of Chambi. And so I just bring this in because I always find, especially when I'm teaching this to students, you might look at a painting like this and assume, right, Cézanne maybe is the same kinds of fruits on the tablecloth. But as a matter of fact, this is the early work of Diego Rivera, right, who produced this still life in 1918 while he was training in Paris under, you know, the most famous artists of that time. But what we start to see is that by and large, at least in the 1920s and 30s, abstraction as an aesthetic system in Latin America was met with a level of suspicion and was not fully embraced and accepted in the same way that it might have been in a European context. And so what we begin, and I'll just give you one other kind of humorous example of this in the case of Ecuador. The artist Osvaldo Guayasamín was really influenced by Picasso, as you might be able to see, Salvador Dali, and many other abstract artists of the time. And he was also heavily indebted to the Mexican muralists. And because the Ecuadorian situation did not allow for the creation of these large-scale murals like we see in Mexico City, artists were using their using the tools of canvas and using their artistic skills to try to recreate muralism in a different way. So this is actually a portable mural made up of a series of wooden panels that were painted that were trying to capture the complexity of Ecuadorian history. This is called Huacainian, the Trail of Tears. And it was a series of hundreds of different paintings that were trying to capture the essence of Ecuador's violent and complicated colonial legacies. And it was actually divided into different sections and different themes around race and inequality, but done so, as you can see, through the language of abstraction. Well, we know from a cartoon that appeared in one of the newspapers at the time that the public they weren't responding to this new visual language in the way that someone like Guayasamín might have expected. And so this is just a cartoon where they're basically saying, what happened to this guy who's hanging upside down? Has he gone mad? No, none of that. He's just looking for the best position to understand the mural Ecuador by Guayasamín. So what we start to see, and of course, this is a little bit later, but this is the larger kind of cultural conversation that's happening in 1920s to 1950s, is that we start to see a move away from the abstract language that was that artists were emulating from Paris, and a move towards the social realism styles that we see as the hallmark of the indigenista movement. And so just a little bit of background about indigenismo. I'm sure many of you are already well familiar with this, but it was essentially a pan-Latin American movement that was rooted in politics, intellectual pursuits, arts, poetry, literature, basically almost every domain of human communication and interaction, that was dedicated to the valorization of the figure of the Indian as representative of national, regional, and continental identities. So indigenismo was centered around many different Latin American nations, particularly those with significant indigenous histories and populations. So we see the most biggest examples of indigenismo occurring in Mexico, Peru, Ecuador, and to a certain extent Bolivia, but less so. And the indigenistas were very much in dialogue with one another. So for instance, we know that Amauta was one of the vanguard journals, and they were one of the first journals to publish murals of Diego Rivera. So there was a South-South dialogue that was happening that was very much precipitated and facilitated through these vanguard journals like Amauta, La Sierra, El Quero, and many others. Now, indigenismo was a very complex movement that was fraught with certain contradictions, and maybe that's something that we can get into in the discussion, in the sense that at the same time that it was dedicated to valorizing indigenous history, indigenous life, it was very much promulgated by non-Indigenous actors, mainly mestizos and Creoles and urban elites who were looking at Indigenous culture in some ways from a relatively paternalistic or an outsider lens. Although there are many different permutations of this, and we can get into that later on. But I wanted to just show a couple of examples of what indigenismo looked like in the artistic realm. And as you can see from these two images here, it had many different manifestations from the work of Jose Sabogal, who was a prolific artist in Peru, who was very much interested in documenting highland life in the Cusco region, and as well as other regions of the Andes. So this is the Plazuela de San Sebastián in Huancavelica from 1932. You can see that there is an emphasis on these very pastoral landscapes. There's a sense of timelessness. He's very much interested in capturing colonial and pre-Hispanic monuments and landscapes. And so there's very little in the way of representations of the incursions of modern life, which we do see very much center stage in the work of Chambi. At the same time that you have artists like Sabogal, who's very much interested in documenting the pastoral, you have artists like the Ecuadorian artist Eduardo Kingman, who's very much committed to exposing injustices that were waged against Indigenous communities. And so what you see in this painting here of the haulers from 1941 is showing laborers who are hauling large blocks of ice from the peaks of Mount Chimborazo down into the cities. And so there's definitely a reference to the realities of modern life and the modern economic engine that's fueling these kinds of extractive and exploitative economies. We can also see that there's a man on horseback. And in some ways, we might see kind of a nod to colonial oppression and its legacies into the 20th century. So as you can see just from these two images, indigenismo meant many different things in different places for different artists. And so just as another kind of example, we can look at the work of Diego Rivera and Sabogal, who are working basically at the same time, and how we begin to see emerging in both Mexico and Peru a shared kind of aesthetic that's beginning to emerge, as in some cases is referred to as indigenismo veering toward the realm of popular art. We see an emphasis on a very bright color palette. There's definitely an emphasis on indigenous life, an emphasis on women in particular as kind of these archetypes of a national aesthetic, of an indigenous past, the one that tends to be very heavily idealized, and in some ways disassociated from the modern moment. One thing that I think is very notable in many of these paintings is that the names of these sitters, and in the case of Rivera, I'm assuming that this is more of like a composite image that's not based on life. But in the case of Sabogal, we imagine that this would have been an actual living person who posed for him. But in the titles, we very rarely get names, right? It's more of like an archetype of an India of Collao wearing her traditional folkloric dress. Juxtapose this with the work of Chambi, and we can see just how extraordinary and unique his photographic practice really was. Now, what we do see is a level of continuity with the indigenistas of the region, right? We can see that in the work of Chambi, photography as a highly, mechanical medium is very much suited to the social realist kind of aesthetic of the indigenistas. But nevertheless, I want to also kind of make clear that even though photography is this chemical process, there's an artistry involved in the posing of the subject, the compositional, the choice of composition, lighting, and all these other kinds of effects that one can add to the photograph. And we can see how the Campesina from Combapata from 1934 is very much drawing on the precedents and the larger kind of cultural conversations that are happening in the work of artists like Sabogal and Rivera. But we can also see, just to kind of unpack the image for a moment, that there's also something quite distinct. The woman is clearly in control of her own representation. And I think that there's an interesting kind of dialogue that's happening between subject and artist, and by extension, subject and viewer, that we don't necessarily see in the two examples on the left. And what I mean by that is, it seems that there's a degree of familiarity with the sitter and with the photographer. There's a sense of closeness or intimacy or confidence and personhood that we see reflected in the image through her gaze, through her confident pose, and even through the angling, right? It's moving away from just this straight frontal view that we often see in these more iconic representations that are not intended to represent individuals, but are intended to represent ideas or social types. Here she's situated more at like a 3/4 angle, and her body is positioned, not as in a way of trying to create like this static representation, but there's a vibrancy there that I think is also contributed to by the background with this like array of cacti that are moving around in all of these different directions. And we can also then think about early modern precedents for the posing and the gestures. This is the Italian Mannerist artist Bronzino, Portrait of a Courtier, right? And there's a certain level of confidence in evident just in the pose, right? In the placement of the hands, and this sense of like freedom to be able to move one's body in a certain way in the act of self-fashioning. But to bring this even closer to an Andean context, we can also think about, let me hold that thought. I just also want to bring this in really quickly to demonstrate for us how the medium of photography is also very much indebted to or inherently tied to histories of racial typologies that are embedded in the colonial period and that continued on into the 19th and 20th century. So photography and its colonial history and its connection to eugenics and colonial violence is something that many historians of photography have really begun to explore. And so I just wanted to bring this in to really show us how Chambi is really radically departing from the colonialist origins of photography as it was deployed in Latin America as a way of trying to capture certain types of racial and ethnic types oftentimes for Western consumption. A lot of these photographs would be used as postcards and essentially like like postcards like we would see today that would have been collected by visitors and brought back to their home countries as these records of the nation. And even Chambi himself was dabbling in some of these visual conventions, right? So in some of his early photography, we see these very heavily backlit photos, the silhouettes of these timeless images of a man with his llama, right? That we even see persevering into the 20th century and 21st when we're looking at, let's say, like tourist images that are trying to promote Peru through the lens of otherness, right? So that was kind of just a backtrack to kind of show us how he's emerging from these larger histories of photography. But I also wanted to bring us back to the woman from Combapata to think about how Chambi is also building on pre-existing frameworks within Andean visual art. So the image that you see on the right is a really extraordinary painting from the 18th century representing an indigenous noblewoman. And this would have been a woman who is tracing her descent to one of the original Inca rulers. She has her hand on the mascapaicha, which is showing her direct descent from the Sapa Inca. She also has the coat of arms, and she has a parasol that's being toted by an attendant to the right. And so even compositionally, we can think about how Chambi's work is also an extension of these regional artistic precedents that were set in motion in the colonial period. And so and these kinds of juxtapositions were, or these kinds of visual connections aren't just a figment of my imagination. We also know that there were scholars like Jose Uriel Garcia who wrote extensively about indigenismo and also promulgated a sort of a splinter movement known as neo-indianismo. And he published an article about La India and La Chola for the local newspaper in 1932. And he chose, right, to juxtapose another series from that, another image from that series by Chambi with that very same portrait that I just showed. And so some of the artists who were involved, Chambi, as well as some of the scholars and journalists who were involved in the indigenista movement in Cusco, looked to the colonial period as a source of pride and a source of strength, precisely because of the very unique situation in Cusco, where in the colonial period, you had a critical mass of mestizo and indigenous artists who were not only taking control over their own representation, but they were also basically taking control of the market. And they were creating art that was responding specifically to the needs and the desires of a heavily elite urbanized indigenous population and community. And so we can see then that Chambi's work is kind of connected to all these different threads of artistic lineages and genealogies, both local and international. And getting back to this question of the role of colonial art, and maybe I'm biased because I'm a colonial art historian, but I'm really fascinated by how the medium of photography in Cusco was also deployed for documenting really important colonial works of art. And so we know that there were reconnaissance campaigns that were happening throughout the early to the mid 20th century to use photography for documenting colonial churches, paintings that were perceived to be on the brink of extinction, especially with, you know, theft and the destruction or the deterioration of colonial works of art. The 1950 earthquake also precipitated a second round of kind of documentation because of the tremendous amount of destruction that it created. And so we can see that this image, and I apologize, I don't have captions, but the image on the left is a 17th century painting, is an ex voto that is commemorating the resilience of the Cusqueño community in the aftermath of the tremendous earthquake of 1650. And the image on the right is by one of Chambi's colleagues, Cesar Veramendi, and it shows the painting being taken out of the cathedral. But what I find really interesting is that he chose specifically to include the young men who are flanking the painting, perhaps to show a sense of scale, but I think also maybe to show, you know, the grounding of the painting within modern Cusqueño space itself. Is a really interesting kind of dialogue that we see happening, where this is a window onto post-1650 Cusco. And then the photographic medium itself is also affording kind of a double view of that history mediated through this new technology that's able to capture and preserve this at-risk cultural heritage. And so kind of building off of this issue of using the visual arts, not only for, aesthetic expression, but also as this critical tool for preserving and perpetuating understandings of indigenous history, is something that we see across the work of many different indigenistas, but perhaps is manifested in different ways. So here we have José Sabogal's Barayoc de Chinchero from 1925. And this is one of his really well-known paintings that's representing essentially an indigenous mayor of his community. And the Barayoc would be kind of the intermediary between the community and the state, local governments. And they were also very much affiliated with the fiesta circuits of their particular town. And this was a very highly respected position, and the Barayoc often would wear traditional garb and would hold the staff of authority. And this was so he would have been a very respected member of society. As such, Sabogal is using the medium of portraiture as a way of trying to show the exalted and the important nature of this figure. And it showed, we can see that he's holding the staff. Sabogal is making every effort to show accuracy in the garb, the hat, the poncho, and all of the different accoutrements. We can see that he's standing on the top of a hill, which is allowing an expansive view of the community of Chinchero. What I find interesting is that Chambi is taking a really different kind of visual cue, in the sense that he's also photographing similar subjects, but making the Barayoc an integral part of the larger community and family. So here we have a similar kind of representation, but couched within more intimate terms of the family, and really trying to emphasize interconnectedness and interdependence as a way of maybe the ultimate way of honoring the importance of the Barayoc, whereas in the case of Sabogal, we see how this Western conventions of portraiture are trying to do something similar, but in a way that is a little bit outside of the Cusqueño reality, maybe we could say. And then to bring this even further in terms of opening the aperture, literally and figuratively, we can also see then how the Barayoc is situated at the dead center of this much larger composition, showing the fiesta gathering at the Hacienda Angostura from 1931. And of course, the medium of photography is also allowing for these kinds of large scale stagings and representations of community that wouldn't be as easily achievable or as quickly achievable through the medium of painting. So we can also see then how Chambi's making use of the medium of photography as a way of also promoting a very particular vision and visioning of the Andes, and one that is in many ways a counterpoint to pre-existing representations. We also know that Chambi was responsible for some of the most iconic and earliest photographs of major archaeological sites like Machu Picchu. And this would have been produced just a few years after the site's supposed rediscovery by Hiram Bingham. And what I find most fascinating about this is that Chambi really set the precedent for how we see these archaeological sites even into the 21st century. And so it's not only that he was documenting Machu Picchu at the moment of its explosion onto the international stage, but he also literally framed the way that we see the site. And these are enduring conventions, right, that last all the way up into the 21st century. I think that if you ask anyone, what is your first and what is the first thing you think of when you think of Peru, particularly for outsiders and gringos, that would probably be Machu Picchu, right? And that is also connoting a particular image and a particular framing. And Chambi is very much responsible for that. And so we can also see that at the same time that he's very much committed to documenting and celebrating the indigenous presence on Cusqueño land since the pre-colonial period, we also see how he's using his photographic practice to document the advent of modernity, right? So we have examples of motorists on San Cristobal Hill, right above the plaza. You can see the Jesuit church over here, as well as the railroad line from Cusco to Santa Ana. And so there's just such a complexity and a vibrancy to Chambi's work, right? It can't be relegated to just one theme or even to just one idea or one angle. There's just so much that he encompasses in his very long and prolific career. And there's other images too that are documenting the arrival of the airplane in Cusco, and in particular Astete, for whom the airport in Cusco is named, one of the earliest pilots of the area. And we also see then how he's featuring things like the electricity company of Cusco in 1931. And I think that there's something particularly engaging and fascinating about this image when we think about how photography itself is the chemical reaction of light and emulsion imprinted onto a piece of paper. And then we also see how that very technology is being used for rendering and for representing the electrification of Cusco. So we have, the celebration, right, of motor vehicles, of electricity, of airplanes and pilots. But we also can see how Chambi has a real sharp eye for societal inequality and injustice. And so I bring in this particularly difficult image, and this is currently housed in the collections at the Museum of Modern Art. That's showing policemen with a boy from 1923. And we can see, the nature of the image is one of control and capture and control on the part of the state. There's a paternalism that's inherent in the image in the way that the police officer is grasping at the ear of the boy. We obviously see these stark contrasts that are being staged between the police officer who's heavily outfitted, groomed, body completely covered from his hands to his feet to his head, engaged in this motion of societal control that can be extrapolated to so many other issues around racial inequality, the alienation of modern life, the urban-rural divide, and the marginalization of indigenous people in the Andes in the 20th century. And I think that it's no accident that that the way that he's staging this composition is also by means of this line that runs straight through it. And so I think that, he's being very strategic in the way that he's putting this composition together. And it almost feels that the subject or the focus of the representation is actually not necessarily on either one of the figures, but is on the line that demarcates them, that begins on the pavement and extends all the way to the building behind it. And so I think that he's doing really important critical work through his photographic practice without even having to say a word. And so he continues this this theme in this photograph here, Campesinos Testifying at the Palace of Justice from 1931. And again, we see this sense of ambiguity and ambivalence. On the one hand, we know from our understanding of the colonial period that indigenous communities across Latin America were some of the most active active employers of the judicial system as a way of attaining basic rights, whether those are land rights, water rights, basic human rights for their ability to exist and thrive. And so on the one hand, we see the agency involved in the community that is petitioning at the Palace of Justice and testifying. But we also can see that there is a sense of societal division along the lines of race and class that's being staged in the photograph with the men in the background who are also looking at the camera, but distinguished, of course, in dress and occupation and so forth. And so I think that Chambi's laying bare a lot of the legacies of colonial oppression that continue into the 20th century, but he's also allowing for a sense of agency on the part of the sitters in ways that were not ever seen before in photography, particularly in Latin America. And it's interesting how he stages these inequalities within the relatively urban space of Cusco, but how this also in his more rural scenes, and this is in the village of Ayaviri, we can see a reclamation of indigenous and Andean religious practice. And we see a more cohesive sense of community that's being forged through cultural and religious processions and festivities that oftentimes are a little bit more overlooked in his photographic work because there tends to be a privileging of his studio portraits, but I think which are also offering a really rich view of the complexity and also kind of the community-oriented nature of Andean life in some of these rural villages like Ayaviri. And using photography, this medium that is so associated with cosmopolitanism and with the West as a way of also showcasing the alternative cosmopolitanisms and modernities of folks in Ayaviri, right? And in Combapata and all these other smaller villages. And I'll end then with this photograph, which has always been one of my absolute favorites of Chambi's, the Ezekiel Arce family with the potato harvest from 1934. And just want to kind of show how he's also perhaps hinting at alternative forms of wealth accumulation that's not just grounded in the modern capitalist system, but also, rooting us in Andean earth and soil and agriculture. So using the photography to showcase this long-standing cultivation of the Andean landscape, but also showing, a sense of pride on the part of the family that is responsible for the stewardship of this land. And again, you see a sense of ownership on the part of the sitters in their own self-fashioning. And so I guess I'll leave it at that. And I really look forward to any kinds of questions or comments that you might have for this presentation. There's so much more that I could have said, but I know that it's a busy time and I wanted to make sure that we have enough time for a conversation. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Cohen. We really appreciated that. The richness of the images and of the contextualization also was very informative. And I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions. We're on several different screens. So I'm going to ask you all to use the reaction raise hand function, because that will push you to the top left of our screens and we'll know who's trying to ask a question or make a comment. That will help the conversation. Often we're more informal in my class and we just talk, but that's not going to work today. And Enrique, do you want to invite your students? We have 2 classes here also to participate.
Yes, please, all are welcome. I think Linda has a question.
Yes. Well, I so appreciate that Chambry was not cataloging a kind of Alexander von Humboldt trip through Latin America with typical types in traditional indumentaria. I'm wondering what you think about, was he photographed indigenous people with much respect and he was indigenous himself. Do you think that there was still a barrier between the photographer and the people? And could you speak to that space if you saw any in there from his, what was his unique perspective and how close do you think he came to being a part of them?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting to trace his trajectory. And this is, I can't take responsibility for this. This has been established by many scholars, Deborah Poole in particular, and Jorge Coronado, and many others. But I think it's really interesting to trace the evolution of his aesthetics from his early work that is very much informed by some of these more folkloric and exoticizing scenes. And I showed one of them of the backlit image of the man with the llama, but there's many others that one could look at that are very much staged and artificial. And that was almost the point. They were intentionally as such, and they were oftentimes not photographed in community space, but they were actually photographed within the stage space of the studio with these very kind of traditional backdrops, with an example of like an Inca urpu that the person is holding. And so I think it's interesting to trace how he started to move away from that and to engage with different communities within their own towns and their own sacred spaces. And so I think it probably varies based on the particular photographs that we're talking about and what we know of his relationship to those communities. But I certainly think that there's definitely a discernible difference between the Lima-based indigenistas who were coming in and who were very who created these very, very extensive logs of their visits to Cusco. So we know, for instance, Sabugal, Camilo Blas, and many other artists were involved in both these trips to the highlands, as well as these collecting campaigns that were also began to build the that began to create the collections that we now see in Lima, for instance, at the Museo del Arte Popular. So there's a different kind of, I think, relationship that's being forged between the Lima-based indigenistas and artists like Chambi, who are not necessarily from Cusco, but from the region. And so, yeah, I don't know if that fully answered, but I think that certainly there's discernible differences that can be tracked even through the images themselves. I think Gudelia had a question.
Hi, I had a question, like, because he was an indigenous people, but how he can afford a camera in that time?
Well, I think that part of it was through his early exposure to photographic technologies as a child, that from what I understand, were rather happenstance, and also through his apprenticeship and training under other prolific photographers of Cusco and Arequipa from the time. So he definitely worked his way up through the system. And if anyone ever, maybe there are many of you who have already visited the photographic archives of Martín Chambi, which is currently run by his nephew, Teo Alain Chambi. It's extraordinary what he was able to amass over the course of his life. They have models, actual, not just replicas, like the actual photographs that he used. They're huge. They're 7 feet tall. So I think that also like speaks to the intentionality of the representations, because it took a lot to bring that equipment out into rural spaces or to any place. And so there had to be a great amount of care and consideration that went into the creation of these images. Oh, and where do we access this archive? So it's located in Cusco, but I know that they have a website that has a sampling of some of his work. There's also a tremendous archive of his writings, of his photographs, of his diaries, and newspaper clippings about his life that are at the archive, but may be in the process of being digitized. I'm not totally sure at the moment. But I think if you even looked up like Chambi archive on Google, you'd be able to get to it pretty quickly.
There is another question in the chat. If Chambi spoke Quechua?
Yes, I believe he did. Yeah. Oh, Carol has a question and a picture.
Yes, okay. So I was so thrilled that you talked about Guayasamín, because I am friends with her niece, Lucy Monez, and she introduced me to the artist, took me to his home, which is a museum, and also to the museum in Quito, Ecuador. And then we also went hiking in the mountains, and we went to a small village where they make miniature paintings, which use really interesting uses of perspective, color, and I guess you could call it a primitive, in quotes, style, and maybe speaks a little bit to your lecture. I just wanted to share that with the group.
Thanks for sharing that. And I actually have another, well, it's not a direct Guayasamín story, but I'm good friends with, one of my good friends, her father was a prolific Venezuelan anthropologist, and his father was a surgeon in Caracas. And Guayasamín needed surgery, critical surgery later in life, and was unable to afford the cost. And he actually gifted one of his paintings to my friend's grandfather as payment, and they still have it today. So that's my Guayasamín plug. He's an amazing and fascinating artist. So I wanted to see if I could figure out a way to weave him into this discussion.
Yeah, he also has a museum in Cáceres in Extremadura, Spain, which I discovered just by chance when I was walking the Via de la Plata, and his work is tremendous. His indicating the oppression of the indigenous peoples, or actually peoples all over the world. Yeah, really incredible work. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
I think we have a question from Gudelia.
It's just a comment about what Caroline showed. I think there is a movie, I don't remember where I saw that, if it's in Netflix, and it's about that, how they do all these little figurines. And it's really, I don't know if it was for one of the classes, but it's really good. I hope I can find the name and I'll share that in the chat. And I really amazed with the pictures. I think with the Professor Enrique, we saw some of the pictures that is in the collection, but I never saw the whole collection. And I was like, wow, even though it's white and black only, you can fly your imagination anywhere, trying to figure out what color is that dress, what color is that huipil or rebozo, I don't know what is the name of the use. So the hat is I really enjoyed to watch all these photographs.
Oh, thank you. Yes, they're so extraordinary. And sometimes I feel like I don't even have the words to talk about them, because there's something just that is incredibly riveting that exceeds language when you see some of these. I think Jacqueline.
Hi, I'm the same person that I asked about Chambi and if he spoke Quechua, and it's more like my curiosity came from like a point where for some people was not usual to take have them take pictures, and I was wondering if the language was help him to accomplish that, as especially portrays, where the whole family in some scenarios. So I was, it was more like a comment, like if that helped him to accomplish that.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that also his ability to really cross so many different worlds. I mean, one thing that I didn't showcase in the presentation were, he was also photographing elite Cusqueño families who owned haciendas or had whole, mansions in the city. And he photographed weddings. He even photographed like a wedding of an English couple. And so I think that his ability to move across cultural and linguistic barriers also allowed him to create these kinds of evocative portraits. So thanks for that comment.
And Daniel?
I kind of have more of a comment. I really appreciate the you introducing us to the concept of modernity as it pertains to indigenous. And I'm glad you said it early on, like gringos, we don't understand. But like, as an American in particular, and as any like modern people, we see indigenous people across the world in our record, and then we see them as maybe from the outside, we see them as like a paradox. We don't understand how they can be like two things. How does this modern world affect them? But like Ruchambi's photograph, and someone introduces you to a car, you're like, well, we'll use the car, what it's good for. It seems so simple. You know what I mean? It's not strange. But like, yeah, people, if you lived with like a strong family tradition, that was one way, and you're confronted with like changes like anybody else would, you retain your like, traditions, and you incorporate the good stuff from the new stuff. Like I love how his photographs incorporate that. But like, I really also appreciated the fact that you talked about how photography could be used as just like a colonialist tool, as merely like typography. But what really struck me was the image of the young man with the llama or alpaca backlit. Like that says so much to me about colonialism, just like because the person was there, but he was completely, and it's like the dual statement that you can't deny that they're here, but like the colonialist powers would try to imply that they're not here, but they are here. Like, Anyway, I just, you really got my mind a reeling in a lot of ways.
No, thank you. And I think that it's interesting because some of these photographic techniques that might seem purely formal in their character actually have long-standing implications and legacies, right? The use of silhouette and the use of backlighting, as you mentioned, is also a form of effacement, of denying personhood and relegating them to the realm of stereotype. And we see that also in, representations of enslaved people. And so there's so much, that so many ways that we can tie these photographic histories together, and also, their predecessors, right? Like lithographs, daguerreotypes, and all of that. And I think that if anyone's interested in these global histories of so-called non-Western photography, there's a wonderful edited volume by Christopher Pinney called Photography's Other Histories. And I think there might be a chapter on Chambi, but it's just a really great resource for thinking about the really different history, like the other photographic histories that have marked the entire world that oftentimes remain relegated to the margins.
Jacqueline, do you have another question or comment, or is your hand still up?
I'm sorry.
That's okay. And I see Elizabeth asked for the link to the book. I'll look for that while Professor Cohen continues to take questions. Any other questions?
So when we are thinking for other questions, I would like to ask Professor Cohen if she could talk a little bit more about these contradictions of indigenismo that she was talking about at the beginning of her talk.
Sure. Yeah. So this was a side project for me that I thought was going to evolve into a book, and then I got sidetracked with anti-colonial movements of the 18th century. But I did, do a deep dive into indigenismo, particularly as it related to the visual arts. And for anyone who's interested in a contemporary and very recent and timely scholarly treatment of the subject, Natalia Makhlouf and Beverly Adams curated a show called Amauta something at the Blanton Museum of Art that then traveled, and their exhibition catalog is really comprehensive. But yeah, I think that indigenismo is a really interesting movement because on the one hand, it afforded this opportunity for Latin American thinkers, artists, poets, journalists to engage in these dialogues that were not necessarily mediated by Europe. And I think in that case, we're dealing with something that's quite, unprecedented. And they were able to do so, through these vanguard journals, as well as through conferences and exhibitions. So we know, for instance, that in Lima, there was an exhibition of Mexican artists in the 20s or 30s. And so there was this really fruitful dialogue that was happening that I think can't be underestimated, because especially when we're talking about, histories of Latin American art, or maybe literature, although that's not as much in my domain, Europe is always kind of looming large in these discussions. So the fact that these kinds of connections were being made, I find really fascinating and shouldn't be discounted. But on the other hand, we know that with some exceptions, like Chambi, like Guayasamín, many of the ideas around indigenismo were not in the domain of actual indigenous communities. And it was oftentimes a Lima-centric vision. And that's also why in the case of Peru, you have these offshoots of indigenismo that was largely centered in Lima, but was looking to the highlands, versus a very Cusqueño-based neo-Indianismo that was promulgated by scholars like Jose Uriel Garcia and Jose Luis Valcárcel, who themselves were also not indigenous, but were from that region. And then you also have offshoots in Puno and in the Lake Titicaca region. So it was a vibrant and fascinating discourse, but it was also one that had a paternalistic lens to it, and one that was also grounded in racial inequality. So I guess like when we talk about it, you know, and one could say that there's something similar in the way that we talk about mestizaje in the case of Mexico, when we're talking about Jose Vasconcelos and the cosmic race, and how on the one hand, there was something quite revolutionary about positing mestizos and mixed race people at the center of the nation, right? But also that's to the exclusion of Afro-Mexicans and indigenous people. So, you know, of course, we always have to historicize these movements, but perhaps it's the complexity that also makes them so fascinating.
Alex?
I just want to say thank you. That was so interesting. I really, really liked the picture with the policeman and the boy and how you pointed out that line. That was just like, wow. But I was also wondering at the beginning of when you answered Professor Cortez's question, you mentioned, I think, 2 artists and their exhibit. I was wondering if you could repeat their names.
Oh, wait, who did? Oh my gosh, my brain is like,
I know.
Who did I mention?
If you can't remember it, that's totally okay. I was just wondering.
Oh, like the exceptions to the rules, or was I talking about artists who were involved in the movement?
You said something of, well, you were saying that they had an exhibition that traveled around. I think they were 2 women.
Oh, well, I think I had mentioned there was an exhibit in Lima that was showcasing the work of the Mexican muralists. Oh, and then the 2 women who curated the recent show, Natalia, I'll write it in the chat, is Natalia Makhlouf and Beverly Adams, and they just curated, that's what it is, yeah. They just curated an exhibition recently called Amauta and its Global Networks or something along those lines. And I'll write that down.
Thank you.
Sure.
I have a follow-up question, Nandi, about this connection between the work of Vasconcelos and I always been curious, and I don't know what you think about this, Vasconcelos and Aldazua, because Aldazua highlights the work of Vasconcelos in her book, and Aldazua is, you know, the base of the Latinx movement somehow.
Yes, that gets us into, so, I mean, it's fascinating because you see how mestizaje really has so many permutations from the colonial period, which I know you're very familiar with, to the 21st century, from, you know, associations with bastardry and shame to, you know, it's kind of its apogee in the 1920s and 30s under Vasconcelos, and then it achieves a second life with the Chicana feminists, who are also reclaiming mestizaje in these really subversive ways that are also in sort of entrenched in like an anti-machista lens. And like reclaiming La Virgen de Guadalupe and Tonantzin and Coatlicue, especially in the work of like Yolanda Lopez. But I think in the 21st century, and particularly in the last, you know, couple of years, we're also seeing a pushback. And I think much of it, you know, is very legitimate in terms, and maybe not necessarily mestizaje, but Latinidad, right? And the way that Latinidad is both it's a liberatory space of identity formation, but it also has its own traps and its own essentializations. And so I think that it's interesting how like the mestizaje discourse and the Latinidad discourse kind of they're kind of melding together. But I think, you know, what Anzaldúa was doing in the 80s and 90s was really amazing in the sense that it was, you know, taking Vasconcelos's celebration, but really calibrating it to the violence of the borders and like the specificities of Chicana double and triple displaced identities of the 20th century. So, and I think something similar could be said for like decolonial scholarship and how you have so many of these different offshoots, sometimes not necessarily talking to one another.
Nandi, can I ask for my students, our class is Race and Nations, and every week we look at a different period in a different country in a different moment. If you could unpack some of the identity movements that you just mentioned and explain to my students what they represent and how they interact, because I think that they would be interested.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, I guess we kind of covered mestizaje, but I think, you know, in terms of like decolonial, we hear the word decolonize all the time now, right? It's become part of our vocabulary. And I think that one thing that I've found to be really interesting is that you have the emergence of decolonial schools of thought across the world and, you know, really across the Americas. And some of this can be traced to the 1970s, looking at Cesar and Fanon, who are really talking about decolonization in terms of the decolonization of West Africa and liberation movements across former colonial possessions, and French colonial possessions in particular. But you also have, you know, another offshoot of decolonization, decolonial thinking that emerges from South America. We can think about Walter Mignolo and oh my gosh, why am I blanking on his name? Aníbal Quijano. And then you also have a Chicana feminist genealogy of the decolonial that emerges in the 1990s. And then, of course, Indigenous studies is very much interested in decolonization. And for folks in Indigenous studies and Indigenous activism, decolonization is a very real thing, and it's not, you know, there's that famous article, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, because it's really grounded in Indigenous sovereignty and the rights to getting land back from broken treaties. And I know particularly at Cornell, there's been a huge push to really expose the origins of Cornell's history as a land grant university, because Cornell's wealth and its origins were in the dispossession of native lands in the like in Oklahoma and parts of Minnesota and other parts of the Midwest. And so in some cases, you know, this question of decolonization is extremely tangible. And then finally, there's also another offshoot in the work of Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, who's a Aymara mestiza Bolivian activist and sociologist who's written some phenomenal articles in both English and Spanish to talk about decolonization from the perspective and positionality of a Bolivian woman in La Paz, right? So there's also, you know, different schools of thought that are emanating not only from these different universities in the global north, but also, you know, its origin point as really situated in Latin America and in the global south. So that's kind of like a Cliff Notes version of decolonial theory, but there's so much out there that you can draw from.
Thank you. Mary.
Hi, I was just wondering if there was any like visible or like vocal pushback against these movements, whether politically or I don't know, in the form of art as well, or was it like largely supported locally and there was like only overseas scrutiny against it?
And you mean in terms of like the indigenista type of artwork that I was talking about?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I think that in many cases it was very much celebrated because part of the artistic movement was also a search for a national aesthetic. And so some of these artists really achieved international fame, and they also contributed to constructing a particular vision of the nation through their artistic practice. And then this also led to the invention of popular art, which in English we would probably describe as more like folk art. But this was arte popular, art of the people. So it was interesting how the indigenista movement was also helped catapult the development of like retablos and other types of what we would today maybe even call tourist art, but which had a really vibrant history in the 1940s and 50s. And so many of these artists were also looking for craftsmen and artisans within rural areas to create objects for a regional and international market. And then those objects as well, like the Peruvian retablos or the mates burilados that you've probably seen at markets, these have a very particular history. Like there's this idea that they're like these timeless types of trinkets, but they actually have origins in modernity. So yeah, there were like a lot of, I guess, implications and offshoots of these indigenista activities that were happening in the early 20th century.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
And Elizabeth?
Hi. I'm framing my question because my brain's kind of going faster than my mouth wants to. So I am really intrigued with everything that you're telling because I'm an anthropology major, and so we spent a lot of time talking about decolonizing the practice. And I'm getting to a point where I'm finishing my degree, and I want to move forward with moving from the recognition of colonization, which is very important, but to proactively combating it and breaking it down, and instead of just talking about how it's disrupts our systems. And I would love to hear your recommendations on areas to start with, Indigenous perspectives and readings that are talking about actively reshaping like social frameworks.
No, thank you for that question. I feel like this past year has brought so much visibility to like to the problematic origins of archaeology and anthropology more broadly. And I've done a little bit of reading in the realm of Andean archaeology just in preparation for my classes. And there's a couple of really great articles. There's one by Sonia Atalay. I'm just going to write this in the chat, called, I think, Decolonizing Archaeology. And then there's another one. I know Freddy Mamani is also a really important voice in this. He's a Bolivian archaeologist and anthropologist. And I don't remember the name of any of his articles, but he definitely is someone to look to. And there's one other that is really good in terms of providing a historiography of indigenous archaeology in the Andes, but I'm blanking on the name, but I'm happy to send it to Enrique, who might be able to pass it on to you, because it's a great question. And I think that there's a lot of movement that's happening like as we speak. Also just the formation of different types of professional groups that I've learned about in terms of like also like dealing with gender inequality and gender violence in archaeology. There have been a lot of writings and movements on that. My colleague Barbara Voss, she is not a Latin Americanist, but she works in California in like 19th century Asian communities in California, but she also recently published on issues of structural racism and gender inequality within that discipline. So maybe those would be some good places to start.
Yeah, those all sound great. If you could write them in the chat, if you have a second. I'm a very visual person and I would love to write them down.
Sure. Let me, yeah. So if there's any other questions, I'll also look in my notes really quick to see if I can find it.
And Elizabeth, I'll add that Professor Cohen said she could send some things that don't come to her mind real quickly to Professor Cortez, and he'll share it with me and I'll share it with you. So
that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, we'll be on that for you. Tristan, you have a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to know if you happen to have any recommendations for like indigenous photographers today who are continuing work in the vein of Martín Chambi.
Oh, that's a great question. I wish I did. I don't. I'm going to be honest. I don't have any recommendations, but I'm sure there is work that's out there that I'm just not aware of. But I think it's a fantastic question and something to consider, because, you know, I think, you know, one thing that I was trying to do is to break away from like the hero narrative of like Chambi as this like singular figure and place him into the larger context. But I haven't really looked at like the longer legacy into the 21st century, which I think is really critical.
I'm sure you're very tired, Nandi, after all these questions. And I apologize, but I have one more question.
Oh, you got me. I thought that was it. All right.
So basically, in my class, it's about literature, photography, and film on indigenism in center in Peru. We're going to watch Retablo, the movie that came a couple years ago. And I was wondering if you mentioned Retablo and the tradition of Retablo, and I'm wondering if you can just give a little bit of context on Retablos and how that tradition that started so far in time, now it's so alive in representations and as a part of the tourism market too, right? So I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yes. Okay. Retablos are so interesting because they were one of the preferred objects of the indigenista collectors who were trying to create this market for popular art. And there was one person in particular named, I think, Joaquin Lopez Antay, who was known for what were not called retablos at the time, but they were called, I think, like cajas de San Marcos. Like they were these, you know, they were essentially miniature retablos that were dedicated to San Marcos and other like agrarian saints and religious figures. And there was a burgeoning clientele in Lima who were, you know, involved kind of in a patron-client relationship with Lopez Antay and some of his other colleagues who were working predominantly in the central Andean region of Ayacucho. And they were also kind of giving feedback in terms of the kinds of themes that they wanted to see represented. And so they were also very interested in representations of contemporary indigenous life and representations of like current events and things like that. And so it's interesting because, you know, these retablos, which are considered to be kind of like this tradition of time immemorial, it was a feedback loop between these artisans and you know, urban patrons who were also establishing the terms of their circulation and the kinds of themes that they would represent. Nevertheless, Lopez Antay catapulted to national and international fame, and I believe in the 1980s he was named like the artist laureate or whatever the equivalent would be for Peru. There was a lot of controversy around this because some felt that in some ways it was contributing to this exoticizing gaze of Peru or the folkloricization of Peruvian art. And you know, a lot of artists were protesting it, like, well, why would you choose this retablo maker instead of, you know, a contemporary cosmopolitan artist? Like, are you trying to just relegate Peru into the realm of the past? But on the other hand, you know, it's also interesting how, you know, this retablo maker was able to attain this kind of fame. So there's like a lot of interesting nuances there. But what we do know is that retablos, and there, you know, these little boxes where you can open up the shelves and you can see these little scenes that were done in gesso and then painted over, and paper mache and other kinds of materials like that. We know that retablos continue to be an enduring cultural icon of the nation, because during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in the aftermath of the Shining Path violence that caused so much devastation within Peru, there were actually parallel ceremonies. There was one in Lima that was just like a traditional, I think, like symposium or like exhibition. And then there was one in Ayacucho at the site of the original site of that violence. And part of the like unveiling or the part of like that ritual of like showing the results of this Truth and Reconciliation Commission was this life-size retablo that opened up and became kind of like an amphitheater. And so that particular cultural and visual form had tremendous resonance for the community in Ayacucho. And the author who's written a lot about this is Maria Eugenia Ulfe, U-L-F-E, who's written a lot about sort of the history of retablos in Peru. So I haven't seen that movie, but I would love to. I need to put it on my list, and I don't know if they kind of delve into some of that history or not.
Yes, there is the aesthetic of the retablo going into the film. Actually, it's very interesting.
Oh, very
in terms of filmmaking. Yeah.
And is it available to stream on Netflix, or
Yes,
is it?
It's on Netflix.
Okay.
Everyone can see it.
Everyone can see it. That's great.
And it is also interesting that it's on Quechua. What happened with the movie is that the director is not a Quechua speaker, but then he started working with Quechua speaker actors, and the actors started speaking in Quechua, and they felt that was more authentic doing in Quechua. So the movie is very interesting, no? Like the agency of the Quechua speakers make the movie in Quechua afterwards. So very interesting.
Oh, that sounds so cool. I'm totally watching that instead of my typical reality TV show fare. That'll be way more educational.
Okay, shall we take one last question? Gudelia.
It's just a comment that retablo is the movie. I didn't remember the name.
Okay. Okay. So
it's
that's
a really good movie.
Okay. Well, I want to thank Professor Cortez for coming again to our class and for inviting Professor Cohen. And I want to thank all of the students from his class who joined us, and thank my students and everyone for your questions, for your participation, but in particular for our two visitors for coming in and sharing with us a new perspective on the questions we've been exploring this term. So thank you, everyone. For my students, and everyone might be interested, But I'm going to send my students an email. There's an announcement. This is totally different, but Another World Languages faculty member is giving a talk tonight at 6. It's Professor Comans, who is our Japanese theater specialist, and he's giving a talk called Hilarity Unleashed, Japan's ever popular stage comedy, Kyogen. And it's a talk in anticipation of a play that his students will put on. So I will send everyone the link to that. That's at 6 p.m. But in the meantime, good to see everyone, and thank you very much to our speakers.
Thank you. I just want to say these are some of the best questions I've ever gotten, and I really appreciate everyone's enthusiasm and energy, even at this crazy, never-ending quarters and semesters. So thanks, everyone. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Nandi. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
I know someone should save the chat because there were lots of great references in there.
Yes, we can stop the recording.
Okay. No.